I've been sitting back and thinking a little bit lately about the state of the gaming industry in 2021, and I find myself feeling a little bit disturbed at how we are still in a place where AAA game publishers are still willing to rush out games that are nowhere near finished, completely broken, or just in really, really bad shape. And we continue to see this cycle year in and year out. And this year in particular, it seems pretty egregious. Although I will say that last year it was pretty bad as well with Cyberpunk 2077. And there's really three games that are kind of floating in my mind right now when I think about this. I think about, as I said, Cyberpunk from last year, but more recently I'm thinking about the GTA Definitive Trilogy and now Battlefield 2042. Now, both the GTA Trilogy and Battlefield 2042 are games that just launched, and so obviously we need to kind of hone in on those games more so than, say, Cyberpunk 2077, but I do feel that Cyberpunk is still relevant with this conversation to a certain extent because we just learned with the Game Award nominations, not that I think they're meant to be taken that seriously, but still, apparently Cyberpunk 2077 is in the running for Best RPG of the Year, which is insane. I don't necessarily blame Jeff Keighley. I don't think it's his fault. It's really the judges. It's the fact that the gaming industry as a whole has universally decided that a game like Cyberpunk 2077 should be in the running for Best RPG. And I know that there are going to be some people who like it, and I'm not trying to turn this into a video that just kind of talks down towards games like Cyberpunk or the GTA Trilogy or Battlefield 2042, but when you look at games like GTA, the Definitive Trilogy, and Battlefield 2042, they're just as egregious because they are games that are being sold at full price and they're just completely broken, and the devs are being forced to come out to once again say, oh, we'll get around to fixing it and patching it and updating it. And the reason why I'm even talking about all this is because it really has given me a greater appreciation for a lot of what PlayStation does. Now, I want to make something clear right up front because I know that there are going to be people who point this out, and that's why I feel the need to make it clear. I'm not saying that PlayStation is perfect. I'm not saying that PlayStation's studios and development teams are perfect. There's no such thing in the gaming industry. We know that Sony has had their fair share of games that have had some bugs and some issues, but generally speaking, and I think that this is just an objective fact when you look at the amount of AAA games that Sony has released, generally speaking, I think Sony has done a particularly good job in making sure that their games are finished and polished, and overall just you're not going to have these type of experiences if you're buying a PlayStation game. I think that that is an objective fact when you look at the amount of games that Sony has released in the past, I don't know, 5 years, and they've all been, held in such high regard. I think that's one of the big reasons why they're held in such high regard. Now, I know that some people are going to say, well, that's just because Sony only does single-player, linear-based games, and that's why. I don't think that's really fair, because that's not the only thing that Sony makes. I mean, yeah, it's not like Sony has a game that they've released in the past couple of years that is comparable to, say, a full-fledged Battlefield game, but nonetheless, they're both considered AAA games, and it's especially bad when you look at the fact that a game like Battlefield 2042 is multiplayer only. They don't even have a single-player campaign, and they can't even get that right, And then I look at open-world games like Horizon Zero Dawn and think to myself, they did a great job. And, maybe that is part of what makes PlayStation's games so good, is the fact that not every single one of them is necessarily an open-world game, because they don't all need to be open-world games. We all know that Sony should probably try to have a few more multiplayer games, and if you look at the games that Sony has in development or in the pipeline, you'll know that that is something they're certainly working on, and we're going to get quite a few multiplayer titles from Sony in the coming years. But I look at games like Spider-Man 2018 and More recently, Spider-Man, Miles Morales, Demon Souls, Ratchet and Clank. I think Returnal, some people had some issues, but I think that was actually a hardware issue with the PS5 where there was like some type of crashing problem. It could have also been on Housemarque's end, but either way, you know, it wasn't that egregious, okay? I'm not saying that when I look towards Sony's games or any other AAA publisher, that's important to note. I'm not just, you know, trying to praise Sony here, although, you know, they're the first publisher that comes to mind. What I'm saying applies to every AAA publisher, both good and bad. I don't expect absolute perfection. I know game development is very difficult, and the more ambitious a game is, the more difficult it can be to make sure that everything is, you know, pat down and locked the day it launches. I expect there to be, you know, a healthy amount of issues, and I had to emphasize the word a healthy amount, where it's like, it's not too bad. You know, if you're buying a game day one, generally speaking, you're going to run into minimal issues, maybe a few hiccups here and there. No big deal, they get ironed out. Again, I don't think anybody is really buying AAA video games expecting absolute perfection, but there's no doubt that if you're going to pay $60 or $70 for a video game, you will have a certain expectation, understandably so. You should have a certain expectation, and you know, Sony has increased the price of their games, which has been a point of contention for some reason. It still is, and I think that this is where Sony has proven that, you know, hey, if you're going to pay $70 for a game, yes, that's a lot of money, but if you're going to do it, you know that you can, you know, trust Sony to not release a game in a sorry, sad state like we've seen with games like Cyberpunk, the GTA trilogy, and Battlefield 2042. Again, I feel like I have to highlight these three games in particular because they're very egregious, right? Like, there are AAA games that launch all the time with a bunch of bugs and they're ironed out, but these are games where it's just so abundantly clear that the publisher just did not care, that they weren't even remotely finished products, and yet they still had the audacity to ask and demand a full, you know, price from the customer. And Sony just isn't doing that. Not only is Sony not doing that, but they're delivering some amazing experiences that, if you ask a lot of PlayStation fans who have played these games like God of War, you know, Ghost of Tsushima, even games like Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, you know, The Last of Us Part 2, they're not going to come out here and say that, oh yeah, that wasn't worth it because it wasn't high enough quality, it was a buggy mess, yada yada yada. And some people say, well, what about the situation with The Last of Us Part 2 where it was supposed to have multiplayer and then they decided to cut that? And look, I understand why some people are going to use that against it, but can anybody realistically look at a game like The Last of Us Part 2, regardless of how you feel about the story, look at what's on offer in terms of the single player experience? Are you really going to try to create an argument that says that game wasn't worth $60, that you weren't going to get your money's worth in terms of what's on offer content-wise, even if it is just single player? I feel like that's kind of ridiculous. And I feel like anybody who's trying to do that is really, truly trying to go out of their way to nitpick something that just doesn't need to be nitpicked. I feel like when you look at a game like Battlefield 2042 or a game like the GTA Definitive Trilogy, there's no nitpicking going on. It's just an objective disaster, right? Like, these launches are disastrous, and all you have to do is look at the user Metacritic score to see that clearly. And I just, you know, as I said at the beginning of this video, I've just been thinking about this, and, you know, this is why I'm so excited for games like Horizon Forbidden West and God of War Ragnarok, because even though the wait for them is, you know, quite a long time, and it was obviously a little bit disheartening to find out that Horizon Forbidden West wasn't going to be hitting its 2021 launch window. They had to move it into February of next year. I have no problem waiting and being patient, because I know that when I do buy Horizon Forbidden West and when I boot that game up for the first time, again, I'm not expecting absolute perfection. It's an open world game. It's very ambitious, and I expect that I will run into maybe a few bugs here and there, but generally speaking, I feel very confident with Sony as a publisher and their development teams, where they absolutely do prioritize making sure their game is finished and ready to go. And anytime Sony does delay a game, they do make this clear. They make it clear that, you know, we want to make sure that the game isn't hitting that bare minimum, like, okay, just get it out the door, you know, and if there's, you know, a little fire here and a little fire there, we'll put it out as we go. They're not trying to do that. They want it to be, again, as locked in as it possibly can be, and they want their, you know, minimal bugs, minimal issues. And I think that it's really helped PlayStation kind of be in this place where they have a little bit of prestige, or maybe even a lot of prestige, depending on which studios you're talking about. They have this prestige around them where I feel like when you look at all of these games that I've been pointing out, again, I'm not trying to bully these games per se, but there's just so much weight behind them because the GTA Definitive Trilogy, we're talking about Rockstar Games. Rockstar Games, right? You think about Battlefield, we're talking about DICE. You think about Cyberpunk 2077, we're talking about CD Projekt Red. We're talking about legendary development teams where, you know, it's like one thing if they, okay, they had kind of a, you know, that this wasn't so great or could have been better. It's one thing to have that conversation, and it's another thing entirely to be having the conversation of this is a complete disaster. How does something like this even happen? And I just feel like it's been, you know, it's been crazy to see, in my opinion, how well Sony has been able to, you know, handle their releases. Sony, objectively speaking, has been very consistent when it comes to the quality of their releases. I've seen some people even try to use the fact that Sucker Punch didn't include the multiplayer for Ghost of Tsushima at launch last year as something to use against this, like as an argument against this. And I'm just very baffled by this because I'm like, I don't get it. They gave it to everybody who owned the game as a free update, right? Like they never even once attempted to sell the game Ghost of Tsushima as a game that was going to have multiplayer. It was just a nice little bonus, a nice little surprise. And what does that even have to do with the game Ghost of Tsushima being done and pretty much good to go? I remember I played that game at launch and I didn't have any issues with it. I mean, don't get me wrong, you know, games like Ghost of Tsushima, as I said, there's always a little bit of jank. It's not like they're perfection, but I don't know who's expecting that. We're talking about video games, all right? I don't think anybody's expecting perfection, but man, it was pretty close to being like, you know, virtually issueless for me. And one last thing I do want to bring up here is some people bring up games like Days Gone. And I think that Days Gone is probably the outlier here. There's no denying that if you look across the internet, that game had a lot of bugs at launch and people were having a lot of issues. But I can only speak from my personal experience, and I remember talking about it at the time when this game was launched. I didn't have virtually any of these issues that other people were experiencing. I don't know if I got lucky, maybe I did, but that's my personal experience. It's the same thing with Returnal. You know, I see some people complaining about some of the issues they ran into with Returnal. I spent over 100 hours playing that game. I was playing it for many hours at launch. I never had any of these issues, not one time. So maybe I'm just lucky, but generally speaking, man, I feel like when you look at Sony's games and you see what they have lined up and you see what they have coming, you can rest assured that, yeah, you're going to pay full price for these games, but they're likely going to be fully finished, polished products. Maybe not perfection, but pretty close to it. You know, the closest I'd say realistically you'd be able to get to something like that. So I just wanted to take some time to have this conversation because, as I said, I'm not trying to necessarily call out a bunch of games and talk about how everything's terrible, because I feel like it's too easy to do that. But I figured I'd try to spin it into a little bit of a positive here where, well, if there's any, you know, positive I can take from these games kind of being disastrous at their launches is that, you know, it kind of reaffirms why I'm so supportive of PlayStation and their studios and their games, and why I just don't mind, you know, paying full price for pretty much all of their games because I know what to expect. But that's going to do it for the video, guys. I hope you did enjoy it. Be sure to leave it a like if you did, subscribe if you're new, hit the bell notification icon, and feel free to share the video out on top of all that. But until next time, guys, take care.